This is really an historic moment. Cuba has been governed since the revolution in 1959, first by Fidel Castro and then by Raul Castro. But this is more than just one man stepping down. This is really the final stage of the transition from the historic generation, as they call it in Cuba, the generation that made the revolution in 1959, handing off power now to a younger generation, a generation born after 1959, which is represented by Miguel Diaz-Canel. But this transition has really been underway for a number of years now, beginning at lower levels of government, and now, of course, reaching the very top.
So then what are the expectations for Diaz-Canel? What do we expect the party to now look like under his new leadership?
Well, it's a little difficult to be sure because only now is he really his own man, if you will. He's been president since 2018, but Raul Castro was still head of the party. Now Diaz-Canel has both of those critical titles. However, his favorite hashtag is "We Are Continuity," and this party Congress was entitled the Congress of Continuity. And Diaz-Canel has been very careful to endorse all of the key policies of Raul Castro, most importantly, the economic reform program, which is underway. But I think once he gets used to being fully in charge, we'll see that his generation of leaders just has a different life experience than the older generation and consequently sees the world a little differently and will pursue different strategies.
So let's talk more about the economic reforms. What is the outlook and how might we expect Diaz-Canel's touch to be either different or the same?
Well, at this party Congress, there was a real push to accelerate the economic reform process. Raul Castro introduced it in 2011 and said it would take a decade to finish it. Well, it's been a decade and it's nowhere near finished. So it's been slow going because of bureaucratic resistance. And Castro in his farewell speech even talked about that. I think we're going to see Diaz-Canel try to really push back against the bureaucratic resistance and accelerate these reforms. They have been accelerating in the last 8 or 9 months, and for the future of the Cuban economy, that's a good sign.
So then as you look at some of the key tenets of those reforms, where was the Cuban economy before the pandemic, right before the pandemic, versus where it is now, given these additional pressures?
Well, it was already experiencing some difficulties before the pandemic, primarily because the state sector of the economy just is not very productive. And that's been one of the targets of the economic reform, to try to force it to become more productive by subjecting it to the discipline of market forces. The pandemic, though, has had a really devastating impact. The pandemic, along with the economic tightening of the U.S. embargo by the Trump administration. Donald Trump cut off remittances to Cuba, about $3.5 billion a year in revenue. And then, of course, the pandemic closed down the tourist sector, which is really the central pillar of the domestic Cuban economy.
So then let's talk about the pandemic response then. How are things looking in Cuba in terms of treatments, hospitalizations, vaccines available, etc.?
Well, you know, Cuba has actually been relatively successful compared to other countries in controlling and containing the pandemic. The fact that it's an island made that a little bit easier, but they also have a healthcare system built around the idea of preventive healthcare. So they have a lot of community surveillance already of people's health. Plus, they have a civil defense strategy, which is able to mobilize large numbers of the population in response to natural disasters. Put those two things together, and they did a very good job of containing COVID up until very recently. But recently, they've seen a new surge with several thousand cases daily. And so, you know, they're closing things down a little bit again after having tried to open them up, as has been the case in so many places.
And as we look more broadly, in terms of Cuba's international relations, what are your expectations now for Cuba in the region, as well as, of course, with the US, given the embargo, and China as well?
So as the United States backed away from engagement with Cuba under the Trump administration, both Russia and China rushed to fill the gap, signing new economic cooperation agreements with Havana. I think China and Russia will continue to pursue that strategy. We'll see just how active the Biden administration is willing to be re-engaging with Cuba and competing with what the Pentagon calls our principal global adversaries today. Cuba's standing in Latin America is quite good, and I think on the verge of getting better, because a number of the conservative governments that came to power in Latin America over the last decade are in real trouble. And a number of recent elections have shown the pendulum going back toward the left governments that were dominant in the region in the early 2000s.